Hey everyone, welcome to the OMG Tarot podcast. Here we are at episode 36. I kind of can't believe it, but here we are. I'm going to do something cool for episode 40, so stay tuned for that. And I know this might be episode 37 if you want to count the Happy Squirrel episode as one. That was a bonus episode. It didn't really fit into the season 1, season 2 schema, but I get it. Nonetheless, I'm going to be doing something cool for episode 40. Today, we're going to be talking about one of my favorite topics in tarot, the animals of the tarot deck. Now, some decks are all animals. The animal totem is one of my personal favorites, and I also have the dog and cat tarots, which I know I've mentioned on this show before. However, in today's episode, I'm going to be focused on the Rider-Waite-Smith deck and the animal symbolism found there. You may find some crossover between the animals in this deck and the animals used to symbolize similar themes in derivative decks. In fact, you probably will. And by derivative decks, I mean decks kind of like the Morgan Greer or any others that are closely based on the Rider-Waite-Smith. And if you're working with a Hermetic or Thoth deck, you'll find animal symbolism there too. One thing I'd like to pay close attention to during this discussion is the difference between animals that are in the image as characters. So think of the horses that the knights ride on. In each of the knight cards, you have the horse and the guy riding it. And then there are animals that are just part of the decor, like the butterflies on the Queen of Swords. Those aren't real butterflies or living butterflies, that's a butterfly design on her clothing. Both have symbolism, but you can read that symbolism very differently based on, is this an actual animal who's part of the action, or is it a decoration on one of the other figures? I also want to keep this discussion focused on real animals, so not the mythological creatures like the sphinxes that are on the chariot or the dragon that's on the Seven of Cups. I might do an episode later about the mythological creatures on the tarot cards, but today let's keep it focused on real animals that actually exist. Animals have a lot of symbolic meaning for people. This is true for a variety of cultures from all over the world. So naturally, they're used in your tarot deck to communicate different ideas and different values, and even different scenarios that the figures on the card might find themselves in, and that you're meant to interpret as part of their message. Sometimes their message is quite obvious, like the horses throughout the deck. Horses move forward, they're progress. When you see a horse on a tarot card, you know progress is happening and there's forward momentum going on. Other animals are a bit more ambiguous, like the hissing black cat on the Queen of Wands. Somebody once asked me if that cat is meant to be read literally as the pet of the Queen of Wands, or if it's supposed to be more figurative and perhaps a manifestation of some aspect of the Queen herself. Personally, I think it's literal. I think she has a cat, and I think it doesn't want you to mess with her. But that's just my opinion. Some people might read it as part of her, and some external manifestation of one of her personality traits, or some other piece of symbolism to read into her as a figure. That's where tarot gets fun and personalized. I'll let you know which interpretations are my personal opinion from years as a longtime tarot card reader, and which ones are put in the deck purposely, so style choices that Pamela Coleman Smith made to specifically communicate certain ideas and use certain animals as symbolism that she knew readers would be familiar with. Alright, without further ado, let's go. There are a couple of dogs in the tarot deck. The first one, and probably the one that gets talked about the most, is the dog that's on the Fool's card. That little white dog is excited to go on this journey with the Fool. It's a supporter, and it's a lifelong companion. When you see dogs in tarot, keep that in mind, that idea of a lifelong companion who's here to support you and be there with you as you make your way along a journey. We also see that idea in the Ten of Pentacles, where, well, it being the 10, you're at that terminal point in this suit, and being the Pentacles, it's all about material assets and what grounds you and stabilizes you. So essentially, you've won. You've reached retirement. You have enough to provide everything that you're going to need and what your dependents are going to need, and those dogs have been there for you this entire time. You're surrounded by children, flowers, coins, and your loyal dogs. In this card, you could read into these dogs as the idea that loyalty gets rewarded. They've stuck by their people as their people struggled and grew all throughout the Pentacles suit, and now they get to reap the rewards as well. I think it's interesting, too, to apply this idea back to that dog on the Fool, because neither the Fool nor the dog know where this journey is going to take them. They both know that they're about to jump off this cliff, and they're going to end up somewhere, but nobody has any idea where that somewhere happens to be. That dog, just like the human, is going purely on faith and is acting according to its, I guess you could say, its instinct to be loyal and to stick by the Fool, and to accept whatever this journey brings its way. Loyalty reaps a lot of rewards, and one of those is survival. We can read that into the dog that we see on the moon. So the moon card is all about looking inward and understanding yourself and getting comfortable with some abstract, maybe psychologically uncomfortable ideas and concepts in order to understand yourself and your motivations and your needs better. We've got the dog who's looking up toward the moon and the wolf who's looking right over at the dog. We've also got a lobster, which, give me a minute, we're going to talk about that lobster because it is another animal in the tarot. But while we're on the subject of dogs, the dog is your domesticated self, and it's the part of you that adheres to all of those social norms like loyalty and fitting in with the group because it knows that we're social creatures and sometimes we need to put the needs of the group ahead of our individual needs if we want to survive and get along. But wait, don't wolves do that too? Yeah, I suppose. But the symbolism of the wolf and the dog here together is that one of them is your base, primal, undomesticated self. That's the wolf. The wolf is over there living in its most natural state, hardened by having to survive in the wild and doing whatever it needs to do to survive, versus the dog has had a more privileged, comfortable upbringing. That dog has a nice, cozy dog bed to sleep in each night, and he learned, hey, if I give my owner my paw, I get a treat. If I go and fetch my harness, we're going to go take a nice little walk around the block. That dog goes to the groomer, and it goes to doggy daycare, and goes to the dog park to go hang out with the other dogs. There's no wolf park. But in exchange for this very comfortable lifestyle, that dog has to comply with human rules. And as it looks up at the moon to understand what's actually going on in its head and underneath the surface as it performs all of these duties and rules like shaking paws and grabbing its harness, the wolf is looking over at the dog and really looking through all of these more artificial put upon ideas and all the ways that the dog has had to change itself in order to fit in. I don't think the moon card is communicating that this is bad in any way, just that it's asking you to examine that, and how does that idea play out in your life? So about that lobster, I don't want to ignore the lobster. With the lobster, there are a lot of ideas about what it symbolizes. Your mind might first jump to Scorpio, because lobsters do kind of look like scorpions, and you might think to yourself, all right, Scorpio is a water sign, and this card is a very watery card. That's certainly one way to interpret it. However, this card is associated with Pisces, which a fellow water sign, so not exactly, but definitely in the same family there. I wouldn't discount that. Other ideas about this lobster are that it's a transitional animal, so it lives equally on land and in the water. That's actually not true. I know it's an idea people say about this lobster specifically, but the reality is lobsters live in the ocean. I don't know where anybody got that idea from, maybe because they have legs and they can walk on land, but I don't want this to become OMG Biology Misinformation, the podcast. But I do want to explore that idea a bit about how lobsters do walk on the ground, even if it's the ground underwater, while being submerged in water. And on this card, we see this lobster walking out of the little pond onto the dirt path. I'm reading it as the idea of acknowledging, well, what's grounding to you as you navigate these emotions, because this lobster, even though it's a water animal, it's submerged in the emotions, it still grips onto the ground. It's not up swimming around in the water like a fish would be. I think on a more symbolic level, you could read into how lobsters shed their shells and they grow and they emerge a new lobster. I think this speaks to the different layers that the lobster is going through and you as the querent are going through as you work through the themes of the moon. Lobsters are also very similar to crabs, which are the symbol of the sign Cancer, and Cancer is ruled by the moon, so there's that other connection here to that idea of cracking past the hard outer shell and exploring what's beneath the surface. This is the only lobster in the tarot deck, at least in the Rider-Waite-Smith deck. Next, let's talk about another animal that only appears once in the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, the cat. We see one single black cat in the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, and it's hanging out with the Queen of Wands. It's hissing, and it's not just hissing, it's making eye contact with the viewer. This cat is saying, "Don't mess with me." This cat is dark and mysterious and not afraid to fight back. There are also a lot of ideas about luck tied up in the symbolism of the black cat, and you could interpret this black cat as luck favors the Queen of Wands. She's not having bad luck because she has a black cat. In fact, maybe things tend to go her way because she's got that black cat under her control. It's hissing and fighting back on her behalf. She's also the independent queen. Cats are independent, they're solitary hunters, and we could read her association with this hissing black cat as she's not afraid to do things her way and do them herself. We can also see this backed up by our first instance of animals that are just part of the decoration rather than living animals. Take a look at the throne she's sitting on. She's got lions on there. The armrests are carved into lions' heads, and then if you look behind her, we've got some heraldic lions on the banner that's draped over the backrest of the chair. And then if you look really, really closely, actually one of my students pointed this out to me, which I think I've mentioned before, I'm still learning new things and finding new details in the tarot, and I've been doing this a long, long time. Take a look at the fastener on her cape. Is that a little kitty face? It could be a little bear face. Some people see that and they think it's a bear because of the shape of its ears, but I just think it's probably a cat or some kind of feline because she's got so much feline energy and symbolism in this already. Why would she have lions on her chair and a cat hanging out at her feet, but then a bear on her outfit? That doesn't make sense to me, so I think it's a cat. And we know lions symbolize courage. She's the bold queen. She's the Queen of Wands. That means she's the Queen of Fire. And for me, when I read cards and I see an animal that's part of the decor, like these lions on the Queen of Wands versus a literal animal, which I read that cat literally, some people don't, as I mentioned, I see that as it's a trait associated with the person. We're also going to see this with the butterflies over on our Queen of Swords, but those are her traits right there. Her traits are bold, courageous, willing to stand up for what she believes is right. We also see this symbolism over in Strength, where that time it's a literal lion. Could you possibly draw some parallels between Strength and the Queen of Wands? I think you can, but I want to hear your opinion. Sound off in the comments. We also see a couple more lions in the Rider-Waite-Smith deck. We see them on the World, we see them on the Wheel of Fortune, we see a lion's face on the Two of Cups, but if you want to get technical, this is a chimera, not a lion, and that's because it has wings. This puts it in the mythological creatures category, which I wasn't going to include here because then things would just get a bit too out of hand, but a real quick summary is we've got a winged lion, and we could interpret this as having some of those courageous lion traits. So as these people come together and clink their two cups, keep in mind, perhaps they're emboldening each other and giving each other strength. There are also a number of birds in your tarot deck. Some of them aren't of a specific species. Think of the ones that are in all of the Swords court cards. Those guys are just off in the distance, acting as just kind of setting the scene. And these birds typically symbolize the element of air. Think of flight and think of freedom. They soar higher and higher, unencumbered by anything, and you can read these as that's the sort of energy that the court cards in this suit have. But then there are other, more specific birds in the deck. I'm going to focus on 3 of them. The ibis, that's on the star, the peregrine falcon, that's on the 9 of Pentacles, and the dove, that's on the Ace of Cups. So, the ibis. So many people ask me about that weird little pink bird on the star. It's all about wisdom. In Greek mythology, the ibis is associated with the god Hermes. Hermes was the protector of heroes. In Egyptian mythology, the ibis is associated with the god Thoth, who was associated with wisdom. So, bringing these two together, we have this idea of wisdom and protecting those who seek progress. Think about how that fits into the overall themes of the star. The star is all about breaking away from social norms and using chaos as a segue for ushering in progress and thinking outside the box and making things better for the people as a whole. Those aren't the kind of things you just do willy-nilly. You need wisdom to make them happen. And if we're reading that star figure in front who's dumping the water out of the decanter and standing on the water as the one doing that humanitarian stuff, perhaps that ibis in the background is watching out for them, really not unlike how that little white dog on the fool is accompanying and, in a way, looking out for the fool. Now, what about that falcon, which I know I called it a peregrine falcon. I think that might just be my opinion or my projection on it. I'm not quite sure that Pamela Coleman Smith meant it to be specifically a peregrine falcon. But anyway, it's that bird that is perched on the Lady on the Nine of Pentacles' hand. Now, of all the animal symbolism in the deck, this one is probably one of my favorites because it's so specific. Take a look at the falcon itself. You'll notice it's wearing a cap that's covering its eyes. In Europe, during the Middle Ages, falcon hunting was very popular, and that meant literally people would have tamed falcons that would do their hunting for them, and they would wear these little caps that functioned similarly to blinders on horses. The fact that this woman has her own tamed falcon, and it's clearly her personal hunting falcon, really ties together the whole idea of the Nine of Pentacles, which is that she's surrounded by abundance and she has everything she needs. She doesn't go out hunting herself, and she doesn't even have to buy food from other people. She has her own falcon to go do that for her. That's pure luxury right there. Now, some readers read a bit beyond this interpretation and read this falcon as symbolic of feeling like you're trapped in a prison of your own making, almost kind of like a golden handcuff situation where, yes, you have all of your material needs met, but you're also very confined to your nice home and your nice, comfortable life. I don't necessarily interpret it this way, and here's why. I read it as more so the idea is this woman has access to everything she needs and she's not getting her hands dirty, which, yes, doesn't inherently contradict that previous point, but to me, I see the falcon more so as an accessory to the woman and not so much the focal point of this card. However, if you read this card seeing that falcon as a focal point, I think that's very interesting. And I don't think there's necessarily anything invalid about that interpretation of this card. Again, as I've mentioned a lot of times before, it's all about context. Maybe there are scenarios where the Nine of Pentacles can come up as more of a golden handcuff situation than a you're surrounded by abundance one. And a way to interpret that is pay attention to what your eyes are drawn to first. Do that regardless of which cards come up. When you pull a couple of cards together, take note of where on each image do your eyes initially lock into and notice, because that's how you pull your interpretation out of the cards. Maybe one day you pull the Nine of Pentacles and the first thing you notice is the woman's face, and you really zero in on what is her expression and how does she feel. And then another time you zero in on that falcon and your focus is on what isn't the falcon seeing because of that cap on its head? What is the falcon being made to do? Who is it being made to serve? What's the entire purpose of the falcon in this whole tableau with the woman and the scenery and the robes and the grapes? I think she has grapes. There's so many grapes in the Pentacle suit. But just keep that in mind. Whenever you're reading cards and you're not quite sure how to interpret one, be mindful of where your eye is drawn first. And where is your eye drawn second? Pay attention to the hierarchy of your attention and the symbols and just simply what's popping out to you and really demanding your attention. Then there's that dove on the Ace of Cups. Doves are peace. Doves can also be interpreted as symbolic of messages from beyond and your own intuitive ability. Think about what the dove symbolizes in the story of Noah's Ark. On the Ace of Cups, that's a brand new emotion, and you're feeling it, and you're feeling it deeply and intuitively, and the dove is here to say, yes, trust yourself. This is a peaceful, comfortable emotion. Get comfortable with it. What you're feeling is legitimate, so don't try to argue against it or undermine yourself or convince yourself that you're not having these feelings, because you are, so let them in and try to find peace with them. The next symbol is another one that's part of the decoration rather than live animals in the images, and that's the butterfly. You'll see the butterfly on the King of Swords, the Queen of Swords, and the Knight of Swords. Butterflies symbolize transformation. Think about the symbolism of starting life as a caterpillar and then eventually going into a chrysalis, turning into goo, and then reassembling your whole body and emerging as a butterfly. On these cards, the butterfly symbolizes how they transform ideas. They are the element of air, and butterflies do have wings, so just like the birds, there's that idea of soaring high and engaging with air and higher level things and higher level thinking. But because these are the court cards and they're the people, they're the doers of the action. As the Swords court cards, that's what they do. They think, they ponder, they reinterpret, they analyze, and any idea that enters their head comes out changed in some way. I think I mentioned this in the episode about death, but it's not uncommon for artists to work butterfly imagery into their death card when they design a deck. You won't find a butterfly on your Rider-Waite-Smith death card, but take a look through other decks because it's a pretty common symbol. I know I've got probably a couple that incorporate the butterfly in some way, and that's because those artists are working with this idea of a butterfly symbolizing transformation. In fact, if you have other decks, take a look through them and take a look at the different animals that those artists chose for ideas and concepts across the deck. You might find that they're aligning with what Pamela Coleman Smith chose, but maybe they put an animal in a different spot. Like maybe they still are playing with this idea of dogs as friendly, loyal companions, but they chose to stick one on, say, the Six of Cups to really play into that theme as part of the Six of Cups. And maybe you'll find animals that aren't in the Rider-Waite-Smith deck. Maybe just shooting ideas out here. Maybe you have a deck somewhere that on your Five of Swords, you've also got a raccoon. And that raccoon is there to symbolize that whole idea of scavenging and pulling what you can from a situation, and maybe even being willing to dig in the trash to get it. Another animal that we see depicted both ways is the salamander. We see it on 3 of the 4 Wands court cards. On the Page and Knight, it's part of the design on their clothing. On the King, it's a literal salamander as well as a design on his clothing. And this is another one that I think is kind of cool. Traditionally, salamanders are associated with fire, and this goes back to an old belief that they're fireproof. This belief may have been because in the olden days when people would throw logs on the fire, light the fire up, salamanders would all scurry out real quick. So really, the salamanders that had been hanging out in the logs were escaping the fire, but the people saw and were like, oh, I guess those guys can survive in the fire. And hey, maybe this old piece of lore is what inspired Charmander. But these guys being the Wands court cards, again, they're fire, and this salamander imagery shows that they've got that fire burning in their bellies, driving them to take action. While the Page and Knight are fueled by that, the King literally has a salamander hanging out with him. And, like I said, it's also on his clothing, and actually it's also on the back of his chair. So similarly to the difference between the literal lion that we see on Strength and the decorative lions we see on the Queen of Wands, we could read these guys as the King has that literal fireproofness. Nothing is too hot or too intense for him, versus our Page and our Wand are just driven by that internal fire. So see how we have that idea of internalizing versus externalizing the element? Which also, the King of Wands also has some lions on the back of his chair, so yeah, this guy's got it. He's courageous, he's bold, he's fireproof. Yeah, don't mess with him. And while we're on this idea of both literal and decorative depictions of the same animal, let's shift our focus over to the Cups court cards, because that's where we're finding some fish. Probably the most notable fish in the tarot deck is the one that's in the cup on the Page of Cups. They're having a nice conversation. It's adorable. The page is just engaging with that fish, chatting with him, hanging out with him in the cup. And the conversation flows easily, and this is the key point here, because fish symbolize being completely submerged in your emotions to the point that you're not even aware of what's up on land. Think about it, a fish spends its entire life underwater, and in tarot, water is emotion. So fish literally navigate the emotional depths and the parts of life that aren't necessarily grounded and aren't necessarily logical and guided by those air principles. Rather, it's pure feels, pure water. They say Pisces is delusional, but maybe Pisces is just fully in their intuition. It's easy for this page to communicate with that fish because the page isn't showing up with any presupposed ideas. The page doesn't project onto this fish. The page just gives the fish the platform to talk to him and explain his feelings and just engage in that really easy, emotionally free realm. Then look over at the king. The king has a fish too, but this fish isn't hanging out in a cup talking directly to the king. This fish is out swimming in the water, being part of the scene. Just like our King of Wands has a live salamander as well as the salamander imagery on his clothes, the King of Cups has his live fish as well as that fish pendant around his neck. So again, we can read into this that he embodies that fully immersed emotional sense, and he's here in tune with a fish that's actually living it. The Knight of Cups only has fish imagery on his outfit, so you could read that still as he's embodying those traits of the fish. So compare the page and the knight, where with our page, the fish exists outside the page. The fish is a separate entity with whom the page is communicating and hanging out, versus the knight is embodying those traits of the fish, those deeply emotional, deeply in tune, feely kind of traits. The only court cards we haven't talked about yet are the Pentacles courts, and we see a couple animals here too. The only live animal, other than the horse on the knight, which I'm thinking the horses maybe even deserve their own episode because there's a lot to say about those horses, but take a look at the queen. She's got a rabbit in the lower right-hand corner. Rabbits symbolize abundance and fertility, and she's got the abundance and fertility. In fact, she's the queen. Queens pull inward, so all the abundance, she brings it, she makes it, she provides it for everybody who depends on her. That's not the only piece of animal symbolism on her card, though. While she has that live rabbit, take a look at her chair. She's also got goat heads carved into it. The goat symbolizes Capricorn, the earth sign that's all about ambition and setting goals and achieving them. The goats carved into her throne remind me a lot of the ram's heads carved into the emperor's throne, which play a similar role. He's Aries energy, and Aries is the ram. Getting back to our Pentacles court cards, let's take a look at our King of Pentacles, because he also has animals carved into his throne. He's got bulls, which are symbolic of Taurus. And now think about Taurian traits. Think about, well, a bull. Bulls are known for stubbornness. If a bull doesn't want to go somewhere, you're going to have quite a time making that bull move. Keep this energy in mind when you interpret the King of Pentacles, because he too is not going anywhere or doing anything that he doesn't want to do. And you know who else isn't? That snail on the Nine of Pentacles. You might not have noticed the snail at first, but take a look at that card right now. See the little snail at the woman's feet? I've always read this snail to be symbolic of slow progress. This idea of you build wealth slowly, you reach abundance through perseverance and hard work. It's very slow and steady wins the race. There's also the symbolism in the snail carrying its home on its back. The snail is protected, and if the snail ever needs to, it can retract back into that shell. Another interesting interpretation I've read about this snail is that its shell has the pattern of a Fibonacci spiral. This isn't exactly the same as the golden ratio, but the two are very similar concepts. And on this snail, they could symbolize the concept that there's a higher power involved in designing everything that this woman's experiencing. They also symbolize infinity, so perhaps, like the lemniscate that we see on the Magician in Strength, this snail is here to show that all of this woman's wealth is self-perpetuating. Maybe this is generational wealth we're looking at, and maybe we're meant to pay closer attention to her role in building and maintaining that generational wealth. I'm talking about both the tangible and intangible parts of it here. Not only might she have investments that deliver an ROI, perhaps she's also bringing the human element to this estate, and her presence and her effort and her love is what's sustaining it and enabling it to continue to grow. So that's about all I have for you this week. Thanks for listening. I know this one was a little rambly, but there's a lot to cover with regard to the animals of the tarot, and we didn't even get to them all. I still want to talk about the horses, and the more I think about it, the more I think those guys need their own episode, because there's a lot to unpack there. So tune in next week, next Thursday. I can't guarantee that's going to be the horses episode, but just keep an eye out. It's going to drop soon. And as always, thanks for listening, and if you want to keep up with me, give me a follow on Instagram at its_OMG_tarot, or you can check my website, omgtarot.com. Alrighty, we'll talk soon. Bye-bye.